Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us on this Saturday morning on this important topic regarding family engagement with refugee populations. I have a few housekeeping items before we get started today. One, we will be archiving and recording and archiving this presentation, and all registrants will receive a follow-up email with a short evaluation. You'll also receive a short evaluation at the end of today's presentation, and we do appreciate you filling those out. You can also find a copy of the slides at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen if you'd wish to open those or print them out and follow along with today's presenter. We will have a Q&A session at the end, although the presenter might ask some questions throughout the presentation. And to participate, you'll use the chat pod on the right-hand side of your screen. If you need help troubleshooting during the presentation, please either use the chat pod on the right or email us at info@brycs.org. So today we have Laura Gardner. Laura has 16 years of experience working in public education, refugee resettlement, and social work. While in public education, she worked as a district level manager for immigrant family and community engagement, as well as a school social worker. She worked for Bridging Refugee Youth and Children's Services, managing their National Technical Assistant Initiative to Federal Refugee School Impact Grantees. She holds a master's degree in social work from Columbia University and a bachelor's degree in education. So thank you, Laura, for joining us today, and I'll hand it over to you to go over objectives.
Thanks so much, Jackie. Good morning, everybody. We have a nice small group this morning, which is actually really nice so that we can really chat with each other more. So I just want to touch base on the objectives this morning. This is going to be essentially about parent involvement in schools, or what we really now call family engagement. And I apologize if that wasn't clear from the title. So we're really talking about the context of schools. And so first, we're going to acquire information about the field of family engagement in schools and some of the theories and frameworks, such as the main one used these days, which is called the dual capacity building framework. And we'll talk about the impact of family engagement on student achievement. And then we're going to look at family engagement strategies that are really linked to learning and are particularly successful with refugee, immigrant, and English learner families. And then after we go through the bulk of the family engagement specific content, we'll move into talking about some of the main refugee populations that have been resettled over the past 5 or so years, and including the populations that are still coming in, and talk a little bit about their educational background. But before I go on, since we have a pretty small group here, if everybody could just write in the chat box whether or not they're with resettlement or they're with a school district. You can write the name of your organization or your district if you wish, but I'm trying to gauge the audience. Everybody could just write so I have a sense of the balance between resettlement and schools, or a little more heavy on one or the other. And I'll give you guys some of you are typing, so I'll give you a second. Okay, great. So we've got a school district ESL teacher. Welcome, Jamie. Let's see. Great. Welcome, Nicole, parent coordinator at the state level. Okay, the PA Migrant Education Program at, I assume, the Pennsylvania Department of Education. Okay, we've got a couple other people typing. Okay, the Refugee Youth Program. And Kim, are you based out of your resettlement organization, or are you based out of a school district? I think this is helpful for everybody to know who else is on the call. Again, since it's such a small group, we'll take a little bit of time. Okay, so Kim, you're with the resettlement program. Okay, great. ODC, I don't know, I apologize if I'm not pronouncing that correctly. Work in higher ed, also working on doctoral studies. Okay, and Christina, school counselor, working closely with International Rescue Committee and others. Great. Okay, great. We got Catholic Charities of Central Florida. Oh, right, you said you were Central Florida. Okay, so it looks like, for the others, I welcome anyone to add into the chat box, where you're from. Oh, we got one more here. ESL in Jefferson County Public Schools, or is it just Jeffco? Jeffco Public Schools in Colorado. Okay. Great, so we do have a good mix between school districts and resettlement agencies and a couple other types of folks thrown in there. All right, so we're going to move on. So again, we'll start kind of with some frameworks around family engagement and some definitions, make sure we're all on the same page. We'll go into strategies specific to refugee, immigrant, and English learner families, and then we'll talk about the specific refugee population. We'll see with time. I anticipate this I think it probably will go longer than an hour and maybe a little closer to an hour and a half, but I'm open to, again, since it's such a small group, we can do a lot of back and forth with each other. So that will affect the time as well. So let's start with this definition of family engagement. So in the world of family engagement, which I will add, it really is a field. It's really developed into its own field in the past, particularly 10 to 15 years or so. There are national conferences. For example, there's a National Family and Community Engagement Conference. Just this past summer, it was in Cleveland. I did a version of this presentation at that conference. There are sort of national players. There's a, for example, it's called NAFSE, the National Association of Family, School, and Community Engagement. And we don't really say parent involvement anymore. And you think, well, that's just semantics. Why? Well, really, very relevant to our communities. In many cases, refugees, they're not with their parent. They might be with an aunt, an uncle, a grandparent, right? And so family is broader. And then we like the term engagement because it's really more active. It's really more interactive. And so this definition here is what we now mean by family engagement. It's a shared responsibility in which schools and other community agencies and organizations, including, of course, refugee resettlement, where they're committed to reaching out to engaging families in that meaningful way, and in which families are also committed to actively supporting their children's learning and development. Okay? And currently, we're in our, in the education system, we still have a majority of teachers which are white and female. And so yet we have a majority of students which are students of color and from diverse backgrounds. And so when we look at the cultural disconnects, given those cultural disconnects, it's often, for school staff to reach out to parents, that is often easier than for the other way around, for families to have to reach out to schools. But there's that responsibility on both sides. We talk about family engagement being really continuous from birth all the way through young adulthood, and then occurring in really multiple settings: school, community, libraries, after-school programs, faith-based institutions, and yes, all over across the community. I'm looking, we had one other person sign in, Clement, Community Liaison for the Refugee Population, okay, Great Lakes Regions of Africa with the School District of Providence in Rhode Island. Welcome. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the impact of family engagement. This slide is what often folks at conferences will take a picture of and tweet. So their school boards, their superintendents, their supervisors see this, right? And so we now, in the field of family engagement, there's over 40 years of research. And I'd be happy when Jackie, manager of BRYCS, when she sends a follow-up email, I'd be happy to include, there are many lovely, 2-pager type documents that provide an overview of the evidence of the impact of family engagement. But so just to mention a few points here, as you can see on the slide, when students have families who are engaged, Students will exhibit faster rates of literacy acquisition, higher grades and test scores, they're earning more credits, they go on to college, and then fewer discipline incidents. So there's lots of behavioral aspects to it as well, besides just academic. And then following that, I always argue that family engagement is even extra important for immigrant and refugee families. And so for those of you on the resettlement side of things, I'm not sure if you've heard the term before that we use a lot in the schools called the achievement gap, or what some will call the opportunity gap. But this is that idea that in many, if not most districts, English learners and immigrant and refugee kids are not reaching the same levels of achievement as their English-speaking American-born peers. And so in many cases, I would argue, like many others have argued, that it's not really an achievement gap, it's more of an opportunity gap. And really, family engagement is crucial. It is the key to increasing opportunities for our English learner, immigrant, and refugee students. So for example, if there's a field trip or an opportunity to enroll in an advanced placement course or a magnet program or whatever the opportunity might be, if you don't have that family engagement piece, and to provide information, particularly in a language they understand, which we will get to, but providing that information to families, students don't have access to those opportunities, right? And so that's kind of what we mean by the achievement gap or the opportunity gap. And then there's the acculturation gap, which we have a little graphic for that on the right. And those of you, particularly in resettlement, you are going to know what this is. You may not always know. Maybe you didn't know that it had a term, had a word for it. But the acculturation gap is that idea that you look on the blue bar, where parents' level of English, so the parents' level of English and their understanding of American culture is, again, represented by the blue and is typically lower than the child. The child is represented by the sort of reddish bar, where the child's level of English and their understanding of American culture, they learn English, they learn the culture faster than their parents. And as they go to school, they're with their peers, they're with their teachers, they're in the community, their level of understanding just grows and grows and grows and grows. And that gap between the red and the blue grows. And when that gap grows, often frankly, the family dysfunction grows many times, because you have situations where the children are essentially sort of ruling the roost, right? They're opening the mail, they're paying bills, they're controlling kind of information flow. Feel free to chime in the chat box at all. I'm sure that rings true to many of you, both on the resettlement side as well as the school side. And so when I used to coordinate immigrant family and community engagement in a large district in Maryland, I used to tell my team of bilingual parent liaisons that this right here, the acculturation gap, that was, in my mind, the #1 reason why my team needed to exist. We really needed to do everything in our power to help reduce that acculturation gap by providing parents with English classes, providing them with workshops, information on how the school system works, all the opportunities available, information about community partners, how to access services, all of that. So that's a big piece of this. And then immigrant integration, right? And so for any of you who are maybe not familiar with that term, it's a two-way process in which newcomers and the receiving society are working together to build their communities, right? So another way to look at it is it's the process by which immigrants become accepted into society, both as individuals and as groups. And so, of course, education is clearly linked with immigrants integrating into society. So where else are kids and their parents going to learn the language and civic skills needed to participate in society? If you think about where students and their families, quote unquote, become American, it's often schools, right? And so family engagement is really crucial to immigrant integration and refugee, of course, immigrant and refugee integration. Moving along here, I mentioned earlier that still today, we're at a point where the majority of teachers are culturally different from their students. And unfortunately, some studies have shown that teachers who are culturally different from their students are less likely to know their students and their parents than are teachers who share that cultural background of students. And furthermore, some studies show that teachers who are culturally different from their students are more likely to believe that they and their families are disinterested or uninvolved in schooling. So that's pretty profound, and that goes along with the final bullet that unfortunately sometimes teachers and administrators will have lower expectations, not always, but some studies have shown that they sometimes have lower expectations for immigrant refugees and children of color. Any questions? Again, we're a small group. Feel free to chime in. Any questions or thoughts on this slide before I go on? No questions, no comments. Okay. So here is the dual capacity building framework. Okay, this is the #1 framework that is currently being used in the family engagement in schools field. It was developed by a woman named Dr. Karen Knapp out of Harvard, and she she worked with this SEDL organization in collaboration with the U.S. Department of Education to develop this framework back in 2013. And obviously the print is very fine, so I'm not really going to go into all of the details, but this is really crucial, especially for really anyone, but I want my resettlement colleagues to really listen in here. The purpose, or let me back up. In the history of this sort of field, when you think about parent involvement and family engagement in schools, and let's say you think about parent liaisons, for example. For years and years, it's been the type of situation where parent liaisons or others in this field will spend the majority of their time working directly with parents, trying to provide parents with the skills that they need to better, support their children's education and kind of build that capacity of parents, right? Well, the reason why this framework is so monumental is because this framework is saying, hey, whoa, 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 whoa. A lot of our educators, if you look at teacher education programs, the majority of those programs do not have coursework in family engagement. Teachers are not learning how to work with parents, how to partner with parents, not to mention how to work with very diverse groups of parents, refugees and immigrants, and so on. And so this framework is saying, hey, everybody invested in family engagement, sure, go ahead and spend lots of time working directly with parents, but let's keep it at about 50% of your time. The other half of your time really needs to be spent building up the capacity of teachers and principals, central office folks, you name it, right? So this is kind of monumental. Maybe it sounds like a no-brainer to some, but it's really acknowledging that part of the field where it's saying, hey, teachers don't really have the skills that they need to do this. And so it's not enough to just keep working with parents. It's kind of coming out of the field used to have more of a sort of fix the parents mentality. And I even kind of picked up a little bit on that in a lot of, when you guys signed up, a lot of you said what you want to learn about. And, there was a lot of, how can I teach parents? How can I, support families, but how can I really teach parents and give them what they need? And again, this is really also saying how can we give staff, teachers and other staff what they need. The other thing, if you can see the fine print in sort of that brownish section, it talks a lot about how family engagement needs to really be linked to learning, and we'll get into that a little bit in the next slide. But there's traditionally been a lot of sort of ad hoc activities. We brought parents in to do this, but you can't necessarily tie it to actually academics or student achievement. And then kind of on the right side of the brown part, it talks about how family engagement really needs to be systemic and really integrated into all programs in school districts, and not just this little add-on thing, or not just one department or one employee. It really needs to be integrated into everything. So that's, in a very brief nutshell, kind of this framework, but it's sort of really moved the field forward, particularly in the past 5 years to create it. Any questions do you guys have on this framework, or comments? I saw somebody just starting to type and then they stopped. Before I move on, in case that person wants to keep writing, the reason why I said that I really wanted resettlement folks to listen in on this is because you guys can really play a key role in that, if you do trainings for your local school districts, right? You're helping to build their capacity for this work. All right, I'm going to move on. I think it's James. Did you have a question? Jamie. I saw you starting to type and then you stopped. I'll keep an eye on it, but I'll go on for now. Okay, so then I mentioned a second ago that we look at strategies being linked to learning, okay? And so this graphic here is from a group called the Flamboyant Foundation. They're based out of Washington, D.C., but they do a lot of not only local work, but also national work. And this graphic is showing the relative impact of different family engagement strategies on student learning. And so if you notice, some of the strategies on the higher impact side, or the right side of the chart, they have a number of things in common. They tend to be more teacher-led. They tend to be very individualized, focused on learning, focused on building relationships and supporting that, what sometimes they'll call academic partnering. And a lot of those higher impact strategies don't require families to necessarily come to the school. Okay, again, in the past, it was a little bit more, well, you still see this today, but where, I don't know, school has a potluck, invites parents, they have them sign in, they write down, we had 30 parents show up, it was a success. That's really kind of an old school way of thinking of it. We're trying to move more towards not just did they show up, but what was the impact, right? Okay, Jamie, I'm going to read your comment. Maybe more info on how to get all parties in our school systems on board. Yes, Jamie, you were with, okay, you're an ESL teacher, right, in the school district. Okay, yes, we're going to keep getting to that as we go along. The other thing, Jamie, and really other folks here, particularly if you're in resettlement, I'd like you guys also to take a look at another webinar I did over the summer for BRYCS. Jackie, maybe you can post at least the title or the link in the chat box. But it was on essentially, I think we called it, what did we call it, Jackie? Parent civic engagement, but it was kind of about like building parent leaders and having them speak in front of school boards, and there was a lot about advocacy in there and that type of thing. So some of what we covered there might be useful to folks as well. Okay, we're going to move on to language access, my favorite topic of all time. So language access, which probably most of you know, is essentially its interpretation and translation, right? And so the main federal language access law, that really the foundation of everything, is Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which, 1964, that's a long time ago, but it prohibited discrimination on the basis of race, color, or national origin in programs and activities that receive federal financial assistance. So schools, every school receives some sort of federal financial assistance. And then, of course, especially for those of you in resettlement, I hope you have this under your tool belt when you're advocating with hospitals and social services and all the other, agencies that receive federal funding. And we said race, color, or national origin. And so national language access falls under national origin because if folks can't access information or access a program due to a language barrier, then that can be conceptualized as national origin discrimination. And then there are some other, like this Executive Order 13166 really just, it didn't create any new obligations, but it pretty much just clarified existing Title VI responsibilities. That was in the year 2000. And then a big one for the schools is this 1970 memo. Again, 1970, pretty long time ago, but I highlighted a very important quote in pink to the left that came from this 1970 memo, where it says, school districts have the responsibility to adequately notify national origin minority group parents of school activities which are called to the attention of other parents. Such notice, in order to be adequate, may have to be provided in a language other than English. So, think about that. That quote in pink does not include the words interpreter, interpretation, translation. Those words in most of the federal laws and federal requirements and memos and executive orders and all that, you don't typically see those actual terms used. You usually see things like this, may have to be provided in a language other than English, or you'll see has to be provided in a language parents understand is a big one. So you know that it's important. Sometimes people will say, well, it didn't say we had to provide an interpreter, but it's saying that you have to be provided in a language other than English. Then for those of you who are ESL teachers and other school folks, you probably know Title III and Title I, but I'll just say real quick for the resettlement folks. Title III is the federal funding stream that schools receive for English learners. It also has funding set aside for family engagement. This funding stream is what I use when I work in a central office coordinating immigrant, family, and community engagement. That is the funding stream that funded almost everything that I did. And then Title I is the federal funding stream for when students are living in poverty. So they, fill out that free and reduced lunch form, and then those are counted, and then it's determined whether a school or school district has Title I. And then some states have laws as well. Now, I know that sometimes when I'm sure you all have heard all of this before, this probably seems very pie in the sky and very far from your reality. It is also far from the reality of some of the school districts I've worked in, but it's important to at least know what is supposed to be happening so we can move in that direction. And if this topic interests you, a number of years ago, we did, for BRYCS, when I used to work for BRYCS full time, we did a webinar in collaboration with the Migration Policy Institute. There was a whole hour or an hour and a half specifically on this, and we looked at a lot of promising practices. I know we highlighted public schools and some other school districts that really went into details about how they carry out these laws. And then we also have a publication that I worked on a number of years ago that I believe is called Federal Requirements for Providing Interpretation and Translation in Schools. I see that Jackie listed the link for the webinars, or well, Jackie is under our colleague John Galata, who's there. She told you how to scroll down and go to that link. And then maybe Jackie, if you could also post the publication on the Federal Requirements for Interpretation and Translation. Any comments or questions on this? Feel free to chime in. Again, our group is really small. I almost wish I could hear your voices, but we'll rely on the chat box here. Chime in with whatever thoughts you have. All right, so now we're going to get into some of the family engagement models. Okay, so I think we're going to do, it's about 7 or 8 of these models. The first one, my favorite, home visits. Okay, and so I think this will resonate deeply with both the resettlement side of our listeners as well as the school district folks, particularly if there are any fellow social workers or counselors on the call. I think we had a counselor up there. So it's important to know that there's been a lot of additional research over the past 5 to 10 years done on home visits by teachers and other school staff. These studies have been showing that it's not just something, home visits are not just something that's warm and fuzzy. They have been found to actually positively affect attendance and reading. So that group I mentioned earlier, the Flamboyant Foundation, they did a study with Johns Hopkins University and found that students who received a home visit had 24% fewer absences than students who did not have a home visit. Okay, and found that students who had a home visit were more likely to read on grade level than students who did not have a home visit. Okay, so this model, there's a national organization. They're based out of California. It's the National Parent-Teacher Home Visit Project. So they're kind of going around the country doing a lot of training with regular old classroom teachers on how to do home visits. And what they typically suggest is that they're done, as you can imagine, earlier on in the school year. They're not done with much of a specific agenda. Basically, it's a relationship building opportunity, and the main question they ask are, or the teachers are trained to ask, is, what are your hopes and your dreams for your child? Of course, they bring interpreters as needed. And one of the reasons why, actually 2 reasons here that I put in the bullets why I really like this is it's an excellent opportunity, of course, for building trust. And in the education arena, we use this, you see in the 4th bullet, we say PD, means professional development, or think of it as training for teachers. It's essentially built-in training for teachers to learn about other cultures, right? How often have teachers gone into the home of a Congolese student or a Bhutanese student, right? This is like their opportunity to see up close, to meet the family and learn a little bit about their culture, just like resettlement staff do when you guys do your home visits. Are any of you guys in districts or parts of the country that do home visits? If so, I'd love to hear you chime in the chat box and maybe say if it's been working or not working. Kim is typing something now. Kim does home visits. Okay. Okay, and Kim, you're on the resettlement side, if I remember right. Kim, in your local school district, you were in Florida, if I remember properly. Yeah, Orlando. In your local school district, do any of the teachers there do home visits? Anyone in a district? I know a lot of you yourselves do home visits, but I'm curious to know if any just sort of K to 12 teachers are doing home visits, and maybe not so much just themselves individually. Usually, again, if you think back to that dual capacity building framework that I shared, districts that are doing this well, it's usually very integrated at a very high level. Like there's buy-in from unions. Teachers are paid for their time to do these visits after school. Principals are on board. Central office people are on board. They're a very large initiative. It's not just like one individual teacher here and there who's like, hey, I might do a home visit. Okay, Christina, done many home visits with refugee families. Great, you call them on the language line to communicate. Okay. Oh, I love it. Okay, so we have Samaran, am I saying it right? At Regis University required grad students to do home visits as part of their coursework. Awesome. Okay, all right. Well, so for those of you, I'm sure many of you on this webinar have done home visits yourselves, and so if I'm sure most of you recognize the value of those visits and perhaps could share with principals or central office administrators in your district, maybe send them a link to the parent-teacher home visit project. Maybe they have lots of video clips online of teachers doing home visits or sharing why they were so valuable and how they improved attendance and grades and all sorts of things like that. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next one. All right, family engagement model number 2, homeschool liaisons. And I think we've got some of you liaison folks on the webinar here. So folks in this role, generally, the purpose is to bridge that cultural and linguistic gap between home and school, right? So usually former refugees, not always, and have many different names. I've seen folks in this liaison type role called cultural brokers. I've seen them called parent liaisons. I've seen them called community navigators. I used to have a very long list going when I used to work for BRYCS full time, and we were kind of tracking what different folks across the US were doing with their refugee school impact dollars. There was probably at least 10 to 15 different names used for this type of position, which of course maybe don't all have the same responsibilities, but very, very similar. So I'm just getting caught up on the chat box. Okay. The purposes, yes, they sometimes vary. Some might have a little bit more of an academic slant. Some might really be more the family engagement, or maybe if there are issues or concerns. Some might even have a little bit more of a case management slant. Some are tasked with, more heavily tasked with interpretation. Some maybe not. Maybe they're, let's say you have an Arabic speaking homeschool liaison who is obviously regularly talking to Arabic speaking families in Arabic, but then are they tasked with then interpreting back at the school? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. It really depends on the district or the role. And then I've also seen some hired by the Refugee Resettlement Agency. I've also seen many hired by the school districts. And I've seen some based out of either. I remember, I think it was a best practice in New Hampshire years ago, where there was one of these liaison folks who was hired by the Refugee Resettlement Agency, but then they had this partnership with the school district where the liaison actually had her desk in her office in the school. So there's all sorts of creative relationships. Do any of the folks that are in kind of liaison role want to chime in on this? Any thoughts that you want to share with others? This is a pretty well-known model now by this point, but there's still unfortunately not a ton of research on it. I know back when I was at BRYCS full time, I did a literature review on folks in this role, and there's just not a whole lot of research. We really need more, a little bit more research, just to kind of validate it sometimes for school boards and others that control the purse strings. Saw some people. Okay. ODC, can you tell me if this is hard without sound? I don't want to be butchering your name. Okay. I work for my home district to help Arabic speaking population. So far, I'm yet to be invited to a meeting in school. Think of myself as a liaison. Interesting. So can you clarify that for me? You work for your home district, which I think you mean by your local school district, right? But you haven't been invited to a meeting in school. How is that possible? I don't quite understand. If you're working for the school district, but they haven't invited you to any meeting. Maybe you can clarify that for me. Looks like Kim is typing too. Kim, I'll give you a minute to type your thoughts. I know, DC, if you could clarify for me, I'm a little confused. Because if you're bridging the gap between the home and the school, and really between, you know, families and schools, you've really got to be working with both parties. Okay. You work as an interpreter. Okay. Phone and document translation. Okay. All right, and then Christina, you have a school liaison at the school and the other assemblies. Both are huge help. Okay, great. Okay, and Kim, also school liaison visiting refugees at school, monitoring their progress, or trying to liaise with teachers. Okay. Right, and in some, I remember when a few years back I did the literature review. There were some liaisons that weren't necessarily former refugees, that were maybe social workers or had kind of different titles or different roles, but still kind of fell under this liaison title. So lots of different models, but in general, what I've seen the majority of over the years, nationally speaking, is usually someone who's bilingual and bicultural, who's really building relationships with the different refugees. All right, I'm going to move on. All right, so family engagement model number 3, workshops. So before I go into these little bullets here, I do want to talk about another strategy that's very, it's a type of workshop, but it's highly linked to learning, and it's kind of another one of those things that's sort of all the rage in the family engagement field. And it was created by a woman who, her name is Dr. Maria Paredes. She is an immigrant. Actually, I'm not 100% sure she's immigrant. She's Latina. And so in this model, it's called Academic Parent-Teacher Teams, or APTT, and it was developed in Arizona, and it was designed really to bridge that existing sort of family-school communication and collaboration gap. And in this model, what happens is, let's say you've got a classroom of first grade students. That teacher will invite all the parents and family members, well, I guess not other kids, the parents of the students, into a workshop, usually one evening, and teachers will share with parents what are the most important skills that students need to master in that grade level. Okay, they might hone in and talk about a couple particular standards, right? And then they're sharing data about how the class is doing overall. Sometimes not even just the class. Sometimes they give like school-wide data or even statewide data. And then each parent also receives privately data on their own child, so that they're seeing really where their child is. And this doesn't have to be super complex graphs or anything. It's just literally, hey, kind of here's where most students are at this grade level. Here's how most students are doing in my class, and here's where your child is at. And not in a, I don't know, shaming kind of feel bad way, more just a, okay, here's where we're at, here's the reality. And then there's goal setting that's done, where parents work with the teacher to set a goal for their child for the next couple of months until the next meeting. And then the most important thing is they're together, and that evening all the parents work together on creating or learning how to use home learning activities. So the teacher will share activities that families can do with their child to increase their performance on whatever specific skills or standards that they're talking about, and they practice those activities right then and there. And so that's really important, because I know I've seen numerous times where, you know, I don't know, let's say there's some sort of home learning kit that a teacher will hand. I don't know, maybe they'll put it in the student's backpack, or they'll hand it to the parent. The parent gets home, they look at it, and they're like, I don't know what to do with this. I don't know what this is, right? Whether it's a language barrier or it's just something of how we sort of do school here in the United States, they're like, I don't know what to do with this. And so right then and there, the teacher's modeling, the parents are usually playing whatever the little learning game is with each other. They're really practicing how to use it before they go home. So again, that's called Academic Parent-Teacher Teams, or APTT. There's lots of videos online of that strategy being used. It's also, I believe, if districts want training on it, Dr. Maria Paredes is out of WestEd, the organization, so you can Google that. Okay, so that was one specific kind of workshop. But then, you know, it doesn't necessarily need to be that, you know, particular workshop. I'm sure many of you, both on the resettlement side and the school side, are doing workshops on just orienting parents to how we do school, quote unquote, in the United States, or maybe specific workshops to teach reading or math strategies, or any other topics. You really want to think through who to partner with. Okay, for those of you who are ESL teachers or other folks in the schools, I highly encourage you to just, a lot of times, and I know this because I worked in the school with ESL or ESL teachers, a lot of times we kind of roll up our sleeves and do a lot of things on our own, but it's really, really important to partner with classroom teachers, counselors, I don't know, reading specialists, whoever there is in your building, especially if they quote unquote don't get it, right? If they're kind of struggling working with refugee, immigrant, or English learner students, all the more reason to bring them in on this, so they can at least observe and kind of see and build relationships, and kind of, you kind of got to use this opportunity to help build their capacity. And since one of the main purposes of this webinar is we have both educators and resettlement on the call here, if you're in a school, please invite, if you've got a resettlement agency, particularly if they have some of the refugee school impact dollars, or they have someone whose job is to focus on education, invite them in to join you, right? And then resettlement, a little, some thoughts for you on this. I know when I worked in resettlement, we also kind of had the tendency sometimes to sort of do a lot of things maybe ourselves. For example, this is not as much family engagement related, but I'm picturing like after school programs where maybe we were choosing a curriculum on our own to use, or developing activities on our own that weren't necessarily aligned to what the school district was using. And so I know some of us work in very large school districts that are, done by county, that have, hundreds of thousands of students, and sometimes it'd be hard to find the right person for the right department, the right whatever to partner with. But I just highly encourage all of you to continue the collaboration with each other, no matter how hard it is, so that ultimately whatever we do is aligned with what each other is, is doing. And then kind of moving along the bullets there, where are you going to have them, right? What time of day as well. I know when I worked in the large school district in Maryland that I mentioned, some of my bilingual parent liaisons, they would have workshops at 8 a.m. in the morning when the parents, usually moms, dropped off their kids, or maybe right after school, or maybe in the evening, maybe on Saturdays. We had all sorts of options. So really kind of keep it open to whatever the folks that you're working with want, right? Kind of a no-brainer, right? But we have to be flexible. And then really thinking through, what is your capacity to handle the language, right? So are we going to do this as a large group? Are you in a school system that is blessed to have the interpretation equipment with headsets, for example? Are you going to be able to, in a dream world, do some kind of large group workshop where everybody has headsets, and channel 1 is Spanish, channel 2 is Arabic, channel 3 is Nepali, channel 4 is Swahili? In many cases, that is, maybe you don't have the tools to do that, right? And so is it going to make more sense to do some smaller groups by language? You got to really, really think through all of that. I've seen some really bad examples of workshops where maybe there weren't the right tools there. We had interpreters that were sort of roaming around the room, that then parents literally only heard half the message when the interpreter sort of got to their side of the room. You really, really want to think about all of that, because it sends a pretty big message of whether or not folks are welcome or not. And last thing, as much as possible, providing childcare, transportation, and food. And I will say, I mentioned earlier, for those of you who are not familiar with Title III, or really how to tap into that, please look into that, because I know at the district I used to work in, we use Title III funds all the time to provide childcare, transportation, and food for all of these types of events that we did. And the money is often there. It's looking at how is it currently being used, and can you weigh in on how that money is being used? Any thoughts on this, or comments or feedback before we go on to the next one? And feel free to ask each other questions too. Again, there's only about 15 of you, so feel free to throw out thoughts, questions, comments, either to me, to Jackie, to others on the line. I've got a couple typing, so I'll give you guys a minute. Sip. Saw some people typing, I saw 3 people typing, and then you guys stopped. So I wait. Ah, lag. Okay, there's a lag. I'll wait a little bit so you guys can type your thoughts. Question. Okay, Kim, we do have some cultural events arranged for families, Thanksgiving potluck with some fun games and crafts, etc. Okay. And Kim, is that, tell me more about that. Is that based out of, again, more out of the resettlement agency, or is that in the schools? And is it, are you partnering with teachers? Tell me more about that. Okay, Jamie says, how often do you suggest trying to implement these nights? Yeah, it really, really depends on what your focus is. So I've seen workshops that were usually the ones that were a little bit more, well, no, that's not true. I was going to say the ones that were more sort of focused on parenting skills, but not just that. Really, I've seen some programs where they were doing literally a weekly workshop. For example, I'm thinking of one that we did in the district I used to work in that was really focused on literacy. It was kind of a family literacy program of sorts, which I think we're going to talk about in a future slide. But it was emphasizing the importance of reading to children in whatever the native language was. And we did have a lot of parents in there who didn't read at all in any language. And so really helping them learn whatever questions, you know, like looking at the pictures together with their child. What do you think is going to happen next? What do you think the story is about? Like those kinds of things. And anyway, we happened to do that program, I think weekly for about 6 weeks in a row. And then we did it again at another, like if we did it in the fall, then we did it in the spring. I've also had schools do things just once or twice a year. And research does show that even doing 1 or 2 events a year makes a difference. So don't be too overwhelmed. You can literally just do a couple if that's. Okay. So again, so I see a couple folks. So like Jamie, when you talk about the potluck, maybe, oh, there's lots of comments coming. Can't read fast enough. So Jamie, what you might want to do is think a little bit. I don't know all, of course, your plans for the potluck, but I mean, potlucks and things like that can be really great on the one hand for sort of setting a welcoming tone, building relationships, and so on. But I wouldn't stop there. If you kind of go back to that slide that had the sort of lower impact strategies on the left and then moved up to the higher impact strategies, I would encourage you and your colleagues to think about how you can really link your family engagement activities to learning, like really specifically, like what are the goals of your night. We all have a tendency, I think, to kind of, again, invite parents in, but maybe don't always have some clarity on what is the real goal for that and how is this going to impact student achievement, right? So that's something to think about. Let me back up here. Yeah, now, Nicole, I'm getting to you. I started my role as a parent coordinator a month ago. Okay, yay. I provide 4 workshops or more per year, provide transportation, food, and childcare. Awesome. First workshop is next month. Okay, I was informed out of the 500 families the program invites, only about 110. Okay, I'm smiling big. If you get 100 families, that's amazing. Okay, that's amazing. First of all, don't feel bad about that. That is amazing. I mean, I've seen events or schools where maybe they didn't quite do a lot of the relationship building side of the work up front and would send out somewhat generic massive invites to 500 people and would get like 5. So if you have 100 attend, you've been doing already some amazing relationship building, or maybe some of your colleagues have since you're new. Yeah, that's something to celebrate, not feel bad about. That's like an amazing start. Okay. Let me try to catch up. ODC. Okay. How do you present the idea of liaison to your school board? Okay, ODC, you are the perfect person. I want you to go back and watch the other webinar that I did. It was over the summer that I think Jackie linked to above. If you just go to the main like BRYCS webinars link that had to do with civic engagement, it's all about how immigrant parents and immigrant community leaders, well, I mean, and immigrant, refugee, and English learner parent and community leaders can really advocate to school boards. What are the exact sort of points in time when budgets are created and that type of thing, how you can insert yourself into the process. So I probably won't go into all that here, but I want you to take a look at that if you have time. Okay, Kim. Okay, great. Storytelling, bingo, word search, awesome. Okay, any idea how I could get families? All right, we'll talk a little bit more about that. But yes, please, anyone chime into Nicole's question. And as we move on, we're going to also provide some more tips about how to get more families involved. Reading a little bit more for students, all families. Okay. Okay, awesome. Thank you guys. I love all these videos. Okay, let's do family engagement model number 4. English classes for parents. Okay, and so I'd love to hear if any of you guys are doing this, but this somewhat, I guess, a no-brainer is, if we can build parents' confidence in their own intellectual abilities that are of course affects their involvement in their children's education, right? And in some cases, depending on kind of the venue or who's doing it, you may be able to really incorporate some of the cultural orientation information on how to help children in school. So, for example, I think it was Catholic Charities of Atlanta. I don't know if they still do this or not, but they used to have this I think they called it their ESL Parenting Class. And they basically were specifically teaching parents the English vocabulary they needed to be involved in their children's education. And they were the resettlement agency, but they would do these workshops in the schools. And it was amazing. I know that, again, this could be done on a very sort of school-specific basis, but if you can get maybe, if you can chat with an administrator, sometimes you can get really strong MOUs or memorandum of understanding created between maybe your community college. I know in the district I used to work in, we had one of these MOUs created between the community college and our school district. And so as a school district, we were using our Title III funds to pay some of my bilingual parent liaisons to be there when the classes were held, so it was a friendly, welcoming face. We used our Title III money to provide snacks, child care component, different things that we knew that worked basically to get families in the door. But then the community college, they were the ones that were funding and providing the teacher. So their teacher just showed up and they did all of their English classes and then, or English instruction, and then they would leave. And we, in a very short amount of time, went from, I think, piloting this in 2 schools to it was in 4 schools and it was in 8 schools. And so that was a really nice way because, of course, especially if you have neighborhood schools where you live, parents are accustomed to walking to their local school, or elementary school, middle, or high school, and it's a familiar place in most cases and a nice place to have for them to take English classes. And very, very linked. In a very short amount of time, it was fun to watch parents practice their new English skills with their child's teacher or their child's principal. It was amazing to see just how quickly their confidence was built up. All right, here's another model that I really like. Refugee and immigrant family field trips. So for this one, again, this will probably be spearheaded by either a school district or a resettlement agency. But the idea is to, how often do students go on field trips, right? Fairly often, but the parents never do, right? So again, you're kind of looking at that acculturation gap and how to reduce it. So I know here, I live in Washington, D.C., we of course have memorials, monuments, museums, everything. And so a lot of students from the Maryland, DC, and Virginia areas get to come see everything, but the parents don't. And so we thought, okay, let's do on Saturday mornings, a few times a year, let's put the students and the families together. And we were able to use Title III money and get buses and bring them on these family field trips. And then our liaisons and interpreters and folks would often help explain or sometimes even interpret for tour guides and that kind of thing. So the whole family was able to learn about history or culture or whatever the purpose of the particular field trip was. And it's also very much, for those of you who are more on maybe the counseling, social work kind of side of things, these are family strengthening activities. To be able to see students and their parents together doing something positive and fun and educational, it's amazing. So that's one idea. Family literacy programs. We ended up talking about that a little bit earlier, but these are, basically activities that involve parents and children engaged in reading or writing together. And I mentioned earlier, it doesn't really matter if if a parent doesn't speak English or the parent doesn't read or write in any language. There are still ways to run these programs. Again, talking about the pictures together. I am myself not a classroom teacher, so I would not be able to spread out all of the different tools that you would give parents, but I know from watching my teacher colleagues, there was a lot of discussion of, especially again for those parents that were maybe not literate in their native language, okay, talk with your child in Arabic about what the pictures look like. What do you think is going to happen next? They would explain to them, usually through an interpreter, what is a plot? What is a setting? The idea of sort of how we read to children here in the United States, how we sit down and read a book with our children, it's got a lot of cultural nuances to it. It's not necessarily done that way in many, many countries and cultures. So really kind of modeling that can be a great experience. DC, I see that you said, I love this model. Is that for the family literacy or was that the field trips one or both? Let's go on to, the field trips. Cool. Yeah, they're very fun. And then community schools. I'd love to see in the chat box, are any of you guys familiar with community schools, the community schools model? As you guys are typing, I'll explain a little bit about this. Community schools, they are both a place and a set of partnerships between the school and community resources. So in community schools, you will really see, they're just public schools, right, usually, right, that have these partnerships with community organizations. It's usually maybe a They bring in a healthcare provider. They've got social service providers. They've got after school programs. They've got summer programs. They've got lots of family engagement programming. And there's really just integrated focus on academics and health and mental health. And the idea is that if you have stronger families and healthier communities, you have improved student learning, right? And schools are really the center of the community, and they're open to everyone. So I have a couple things. If you are not familiar with this model, which is pretty popular across the country, I presented at the Community Schools National Forum in Baltimore this past spring, had hundreds, maybe over 1,000, I don't recall. I think it was over 1,000 individuals from across the country. But so I encourage you to go to the Coalition for Community Schools website. It's based out of the Institute for Educational Leadership, which is at iel.org, and you can click there. Also, Jackie, I don't know if you have the link. I think I put it at the bottom in the notes section, but there, if you'd like to see how this model works with resettlement, there is a community school specifically with a refugee focus in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, that I've seen presenting before. I know if you just Google Refugee Community School, Lancaster, Pennsylvania, it will come up. It's also, they partner with not only the resettlement agency, but I know the Rotary Club, and then I think it's what they call their Educational Service Center, IU13. Anyway, take a look at that. It's an amazing model that basically was developed with the idea that a lot of refugee students and families were struggling after their initial resettlement period, like we all see after the first 3 or so months. And so the schools, they stepped up and they said, hey, we can put together this community school model, have all these different partnerships going on, and really provide wraparound services for refugee families. So I encourage you to Google that. And Jackie, if you see the link in my notes, maybe go ahead and put it, but I may have it. Okay, and then parent panels. This is another favorite of mine. So in this model, just imagine with me for a minute, you're going to have, let's say, a row of refugee parents, okay, or refugee and immigrant, other backgrounds of parents. Doesn't have to be specific to refugee. And maybe let's say you have 4 parents. Maybe you have an Iraqi parent, a Bhutanese parent, a refugee from Burma, Congolese. Okay, they're going to sit at a table up front, or maybe in a circle, as this picture shows, and then you're going to have a facilitator. Could be someone from the resettlement agency, could be someone from the school district, really be anybody. Who's going to feed questions to them that are things like, tell us about the schools in your home country. Tell us about the role that parents and families had in their children's education in your home country, which you're going to get lots of different answers. Tell us a little bit about your own story if you're willing to share, right? Those kinds of questions. And in the audience is teachers. It's classroom teachers, it's principals, it's school counselors, it's whoever. And so the purpose, you have parents sharing information about their background and their culture. And I really like this because it's an opportunity for them to be the teacher and the expert, right? And then also it's a training opportunity for teachers, again, to become a little bit more culturally proficient and to learn about the population. And again, because it's something that's set up and organized, you're going to be able to, you're going to take the time to put the interpreters in place, and just, it's a space where you can have conversations that frankly in schools normally there's no time for, right? So that's another model that I've used very successfully a number of times. Okay, awesome. I'm just catching up on the comments. Christina has a similar thing called the Family Resource Center, awesome, and a newcomer school. Okay, cool. And thank you, Jackie, for including the Lancaster, Pennsylvania thing. Okay, awesome. All right. I'm gonna say this really quick, and then I think we're gonna get into our country. Just a quick word of caution on international nights, multicultural fairs, and that kind of thing. They do have a place, right, in this work for sure. But I just want you guys to be a little cautious that they can sometimes be a little bit tokenistic. They tend to be about kind of food and flags, and at least in my experience. I've seen both in districts I've worked in as well as, again, when I used to work for BRYCS full time, where, you know, it might be this, in some cases, the student or often the parents or the families kind of together. Maybe let's say they're from Iraq. They set up a table about Iraq, and then over here there's a table set up about Bhutan, and then there's a table set up about, you know, whatever, the Congo. And then, you know, other students and families are kind of walking through. They might be tasting food. They might be seeing pictures of the flags. Again, that can have a place, but if that's kind of the only level of family engagement that's happening, again, it can be a little bit tokenistic at times, and you just really want to watch sort of how it's done. So I have a lot of thoughts on that, but in the interest of time, I think I'll just leave it at that. Okay, then a couple of you guys were asking earlier a little bit more about how to encourage attendance of refugee parents at school events. I just want to reiterate before I say this slide that it's family engagement is really, it's a process. It's not all about showing up to events. It's really a process of relationship building between families and between teachers and other school staff. Okay, that's really the foundation of this work. It's not all about just showing up at events. But I know that's the question everybody always asks, so I'm including this slide. So again, as I just said, spend time first really building relationships and trust. That's the foundation of all of this. And then really involving, if you haven't already, I guess this bullet is more for school district folks, involving the resettlement agencies and the ethnic community-based organizations, maybe faith-based leaders, your imams, mosques, you know, different things, and just refugee community leaders. If you don't know who those people are, resettlement agencies can tell you usually, or poke around and do some research, make some phone calls. There are community leaders, there are faith-based leaders. They exist. You need to find them if you don't know who they are. Third thing here, have parents choose the topics to be discussed. That's crucial. Utilize liaisons. They're your cultural brokers. They're bridging that gap. They're really going to tell families, hey, this person's cool, this workshop is cool, come, you know, they're going to really kind of give the stamp of approval. Providing interpretation and translation, as we discussed. Also for outreach. How many times have I seen people, unfortunately, send out flyers only in English, and then they wonder why no one comes from other, you know, language groups. And then they even use that to document the fact that they didn't need to request an interpreter because no one showed up. So make sure the outreach is also, you're also thinking about, are you using a phone interpretation system? Are you using translated flyers? Are you making personalized phone calls? Personalized phone calls are probably, frankly, actually one of the best ways. And I think I didn't really include that here. Transportation and childcare, we talked about that. And then consider occasionally events that are specific for English learner or refugee and immigrant parents. All right, now we're going to talk about, feel free again to chime in. I know we probably only have, I don't want to go longer than an hour and a half, so we only have about 15 minutes left. And I'm just going to touch on some of the top populations that are coming in. Here were now we're just ending the fiscal year. In fiscal year 2017, here were the top populations, refugee populations that the US government resettled. And then in fiscal year 2018, which we're just literally wrapping up, these are the top populations. And so I also want to point out the top languages. Arabic, number 1, Nepali or Nepalese, you hear both terms used. Second, Somali, number 3rd, Karen from Burma, number 4. So anyway, you can take a look at that and you'll have the slides. Again, this is really honed in on refugee languages. So for ESL in general, Spanish is always by far the number 1, but we're really honed in on that Okay, so just a little bit about the Congolese. We'll do, I don't know if we'll get to all 4 or 5 of these, but we'll do what we can here. And so just a little bit about the conflict in general. So we have this ongoing Congolese refugee crisis that's been the product of over 16 years of armed conflict and unrest, right? It's a highly complex conflict. At times it's involved armies of 9 countries and dozens of other armed groups. And even though there was a peace accord signed in 2003, there's still a lot of unrest in the eastern DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo. Lots of killings, disappearances, mass rape, torture, and sexual violence being used as a weapon of war. Okay, so when we're talking about our folks coming from the Congo, again, mostly ethnic minorities from the eastern DRC. Keep in mind that the DRC is incredibly ethnically diverse. We're talking over 250 ethnic groups speaking over 700 languages and dialects. Okay, most, if not all, of the Congolese that are coming have witnessed or experienced some form of violence. And when they fled the Congo, most of the refugees have been living in Uganda, Rwanda, Tanzania, and Burundi. Okay, so now this slide, I just wanted to give you an overview of the conflict. But then here's some info for educators, specifically in the refugee camps. There is free primary education, but you know, fairly informal, and the lack of previous education is still pretty much the #1 issue for Congolese in U.S. schools. And even those that are 18 and older who say that they have some form of schooling, many can still not read or write. The top languages of this population are Kinyarwanda, Kiswahili, which is sometimes just dubbed Swahili, and Kinyamulonge, which I'm not 100% sure I'm pronouncing. Someone please correct me on that third one. And then pretty major parenting differences with discipline and supervision, as we see with a lot of our refugee populations, but there is a fair amount of physical discipline that's common with the Congolese. And as far as supervision, just a different approach and what would be considered to be inadequate by American child welfare standards. I think with this population, it's very important to make sure that you provide some sort of orientation for them specific to schools, you know, what to expect in schools and that type of thing. Hey, Jackie, could you clarify for Odysseus asking where we can find, where they can find that chart that I was going on? I noticed Odysseus will be, this is recorded, and I believe Jackie said you can also download the PowerPoint, but she will clarify.
Yes.
Is it the lower right-hand corner that they download it?
Yes, lower right-hand corner, and all registrants will receive a copy of the slides as well.
Okay, perfect, thanks. All right, so the Bhutanese, oh, the chart, yes, Odysseus, the chart with the different languages. Yeah, sounds like when you get the follow-up email, you'll get the whole PowerPoint. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the Bhutanese. So for those of you who are not familiar, and please, resettlement friends, feel free to chime in here. But the idea or the situation with the Bhutanese is that in the early 1990s, you had Bhutanese individuals that were of Nepali origin that were suddenly stripped of their citizenship. Bhutan enacted this royal decree where they said they're going to have a single national identity. And so all of the Bhutanese that were of ethnic Nepalese origin, and I believe there was over 100,000 of them, they were forced to leave. And so they fled to refugee camps in eastern Nepal, but Nepal didn't really want them either. So they were sort of stateless, caught between worlds. And so a little bit of information for educators is that in the refugee camps in Nepal, there is free education through 9th grade, and they generally use Nepal's curriculum. And then this link here, this Bhutanese refugees.com, I really like it. Includes a virtual tour of a refugee camp and a section that's on education. And one point here too that I think is a little extra confusing with this population, especially for younger kids who have, really any kid, since in any case they've been living there since the 1990s, kids have been born in these camps in eastern Nepal and will often say that they're from Nepal and they are speaking Nepali or Nepalese, but sometimes educators are missing the fact that their families are actually refugee families from Bhutan. It gets a little bit confusing. When you're asking where folks are from, especially if children are from were born and raised in refugee camps, and in this case are of ethnic origin of where they fled. It's sort of an extra confusing. All right, so for our Syrians, I just like to point out that really before the conflict, Syria was a fairly lower middle income country with really high levels of literacy, education, and employment. And we've been seeing lots about the Syrian crisis on the news since around 2011. So there were a few factors that led to that conflict. There was a lot of government mismanagement during, there was a 7-year drought from 2003 to 2010 that forced hundreds of thousands of people to leave their land and move to cities. So there was lots of instability caused by this mass migration. And then in 2011, the uprising began as peaceful protests. And the government arrested and reportedly tortured school children who had written anti-government graffiti on a wall. And then also around the same time, there was the Arab Spring movements in Egypt and Tunisia, where they were calling for democratic reforms, and many believe that that also influenced what happened in Syria. So anyway, things have been very bad since right around 2011. And there were lots of widespread arrests and beatings and interrogations and torture. Street protesters were killed. And then there were lots of brigades and sort of armies and different groups that were fighting the Syrian government, and then ISIS got involved. So anyway, it's very, very complex. Most of the refugees have fled to either Lebanon, Turkey, Jordan, Iraq, or Egypt. But in this case, only about 15% of the refugees live in camps. Many live in cities and towns and rural areas, often in difficult circumstances. And there's something like, there's millions, 6 million Syrian refugees. I don't even know how high it is at this point. I think this statistic is a little bit old. So for the information for educators now on Syrians. So again, this tends to be a fairly highly educated population because before the conflict, there was free public education for all. And the literacy rate before the conflict was extremely high. It's higher than the United States. It's 90% for men, 77% for women. And Syrians, this is kind of a generalization, but are typically tend to parent their children closely, helping with schoolwork and monitoring all activities the best that they can. One other thing that I did not include on the slide, which is important to point out, is that in Syria, girls can get married as young as 13. And one statistic that was looking at marriages of Syrian refugees who had fled to Jordan, there was a stat from 2013 that said 25% of all of those marriages by Syrian refugees in Jordan involved a female between the ages of 15 and 17. So there's a lot of that younger marriages going on, which will surely impact life in the U.S. That's so uncommon and here. Okay, a little bit on Burma. The refugee populations from Burma have been coming for years now. Basically, just the history there is that the different ethnic minorities, which you'll hear the Karen, the Karenni, the Chin, there are many other ones, they, for years, experienced forced labor, torture, arbitrary executions, and rape under Burma's military regime. And so I think one of the populations I'll point out here of the Chin, which are typically in Malaysia, they're not legally permitted to attend public school in Malaysia, but there's a group called the Chin Student Organization that formed in 2005 when university students from Burma found a lot of Chin children wandering the streets of Kuala Lumpur, and so the students really took it upon themselves to teach the kids, and they've really fill the gap over the years. And then for the other groups that are in camps on the Thai-Burma border, there are, some primary schools and some have middle schools. And then I encourage you guys to Google the Refugees from Burma in the United States video on YouTube. It has a really, has some good information about schools. All right, and then our Iraqi refugee friends. So a lot of us, as most of us know, the Iraq War started in 2003, and then the U.S. formally withdrew in 2011. So those were kind of the primary years. And it's important to know with this population, and again, I'm mentioning this, a lot of, let's say even you had a family that was resettled 4 or 5 years ago, and you're just meeting them tomorrow. I mean, a lot of you are, even if a certain population, for any of the ones I'm mentioning, if they're not coming as much now, you're still gonna, likely encounter them in future years as they go through the school system. So with the Iraqis, a lot of the Iraqis were doctors and lawyers and engineers and other highly educated professions. And when they were resettled, I remember this from when I was still at BRYCS, there was often a lot of surprise and disappointment to not be further helped by the US government with regards to their employment qualifications. So, a lot of times their certifications or their degrees didn't really apply or they weren't recognized, and you suddenly had, like a doctor whose job was now to mop the floors, right? So there was a lot of anger around that. Before the wars, Iraq used to have one of the best educational systems in the Middle East with high rates of literacy, and higher education was free. But of course now many schools have been damaged by bombing, and really the education in the countries of first asylum, whether it's Jordan or Lebanon, etc., it really varies. And then I think last but not least, we'll mention the Somalis. And an important point for, wait, let me back up just about the conflict really quick. Basically, the conflict has to do with the onset of the civil war in 1991. So this has been going on a very long time. Somalis were fleeing their countries in great numbers. The whole time I've worked in resettlement, we've been resettling Somalis. For educators, note that they have a very rich oral tradition. And this makes sense because the Somali language did not have a written form until 1972. And so obviously the way literacy is thought of and the way literacy is integrated into their lives is very different than how it is for most in the United States. And this group traditionally comes with pretty limited formal education. So many Somalis have been living in refugee camps their whole lives. And another final fun quote that I will leave you with before I take any final questions is family engagement, or this, parent involvement with Somalis is kind of interesting. When we years ago wrote an article that was called Involving Refugee Parents in Education, it's still on the BRYCS website. Our opening quote was from a Somali parent that don't think I remember to include the quote. Basically, it had to do with why Somali parents were asking to do the teacher's work for them. Like they were saying, well, why am I supposed to do X, Y, and Z at home? Isn't that the teacher's job? Why are they asking me for my help? Like it was a very, different way of thinking about it and understanding their role in their children's education. All right, so with that, we covered the foundational, aspects of family engagement. We talked a lot about strategies that can be used with refugee, immigrant, English learner populations, and then we did a little brief overview of the top 5 or so refugee groups. I can stick around for a few minutes. Do we have any final thoughts or questions, comments? I'd be happy. Oh, one thing I did want to point out. If you liked this topic, which of course was covered pretty quickly in an hour and a half, through my consulting company, we do a 10-hour online course on this topic. If you go to www.immigrants, with an S, refugees, with an S, and schools.org, I'll put my link in the box. You can take a look at our online course there. Schools.org. And other resources along those lines. Immigrants-refugees-schools.org. Any other thoughts or questions or comments? Again, I encourage, especially if you're on the resettlement side of things, to take a look at the webinar that we did back in the summer that has the word civic engagement in it. If you go to the main webinar page, you can find a little bit more about what are the best ways to work with refugee parent and community leaders to kind of create change in your local school districts, and where are the best places or times of year to kind of insert yourself into the budget process for school districts and that type of thing. I don't think we have any other final questions. I'll hang out another minute or so. Anybody else? Oh, now I see a couple people typing. You're welcome. You're welcome, Jamie. Please share this with others. Jackie, anything else to wrap us up?
No, thank you for your time today, and thank you for everybody for joining us on a Saturday. If you do have additional questions, you can email us at info@brycs.org or call us toll free. I'm happy to put you in touch with Laura for further questions. We did record this webinar, and we will be archiving it. You will receive an email on Monday with the link to the recording, a copy of the PowerPoint slides, and a reminder of these links that Laura has recommended, these resources that she's recommended, so you can reach those directly and you're not scrambling to save everything in the chat box today. The email on Monday will also include an evaluation for today's presentation. Since we have such a small group, if you could all take the time to fill that out, that would be really wonderful. You'll also be redirected to that evaluation when we close today's presentation. So again, if you have any further questions, please do email us, and we thank you for your time. Hope you can join future webinars.
Have a great day, everybody. Take care.
Thanks, Laura. Have a nice weekend.
Thanks, you too, Jackie. See ya.